The following podcast is going to contain spoilers, along with me, just a regular guy, talking about all the things I love, such as comics, movies, television, music, and books. So yeah, proceed at your own risk. Oh my gosh, folks, this is it. You're listening to Just Another Fanboy. Aren't you happy? I am, because I'm Steve and I'm your host. How's it going? You know, when I think back, when I stretch my mind back, when I take it out for a walk, and I go backwards in time, and I think back to the days, my history of reading and collecting comics. And I think about those books that I loved that weren't originally published by the big two. My top three, they've probably got to be ElfQuest, Madman, and Akira. And I say not originally published by the big two because ElfQuest, Marvel did own the license to ElfQuest for a bit and colorized and published some of those books. They also owned the license, well, at least they reprinted and published Akira. And that's how I read most of the series, was through Marvel's reprints. Now, if you're not aware, Akira is a Japanese cyberpunk manga series by Katsuhiro Otomo. It was first serialized in the pages of Young magazine from 1982 to 1990. And the way they set up the whole series, in 1992, a nuclear explosion destroys Tokyo and starts World War III. 38 years later, in 2030, a new city called Neo-Tokyo has been built on an artificial island in Tokyo Bay. And Neo-Tokyo is set to host the 32nd Olympic Games. That is the backdrop to this story. Now, when it was originally published, it was a black and white book. And as I said, it was serialized in a magazine, but it was then at some point, as it was being serialized, it was being collected into what would end up being 6 volumes. And those were put out by Kendosha. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. They are, of course, I believe a Japanese company. But Marvel also started reprinting the books and putting them out as part of their Epic line. And those were made into 38 issues that were published between 1989 and 1995. And again, that's how I read them. And they colorized it. And I remember reading a whole thing about how they had to do it, because if you're not aware, if you've never read manga, or if you've picked up an authentic manga book and tried to read it and just got really confused, they're read back to front, right to left. They're read the exact opposite in the way that we read books here in America. And when they published these for the American audience, they didn't do what they do now. If you go, my daughter reads manga and she'll go into the library and she'll pick out a big stack of manga books and she'll bring them home and they'll be translated into English, but they left the formatting the same. She has to read it back to front, right to left. Whereas when they republished Akira for the American or the English audience, they had to go in and reformat everything so that you could read it front to back, left to right. And that wasn't the only changes that they made. A couple of them I found pretty interesting so in the English version, as I said, it starts in 1992, or at least it states that in 1992, there's this nuclear explosion. And then the story takes place 38 years later in 2030. In the original version, the Japanese version, the nuclear explosion happened in 1982, and then the rest of the story takes place in 2019. That was just last year. But they were producing this series. They started it in 82. And so that's, I guess, by the time they started publishing it for the American audience, they wanted it to be more futuristic. So the explosion happened in what would have been the future at that point, which would have been 1990. 92. So some of the main characters in this book, you've got Kaneda. He's like the main dude. He has a group of buddies. They're hooligans. They're juvenile delinquents. They're also part of a motorcycle gang. Him and Tetsuo and Yamagata, and I don't remember any of their other names, but they're a group, and they hang out at a bar, and they go and they ride their bikes, and they cause mayhem and destruction, and they take drugs, and they're not good people. Another interesting fact is Kaneda, his name is actually pronounced Kaneda. The Japanese pronunciation of his name is Kaneda. But when they made the movie, because they made a movie, an anime, it's an incredible feat of animation. And I read that they used, I can't remember the number, I want to say 51 colors never before used in an animated film when they made the Akira anime. But when they dubbed it to English for the English audience, they felt that having the main character named Kaneda, the American audience would find that silly because they would think his name is Canada, which is our neighbor to the north. So they just changed the pronunciation to Kaneda. There was also a dude. So you have this faction that are anti-government. The government, I guess, kind of really has a boot heel on the Japanese citizen. Very almost totalitarian type of rule. And so there's a group of rebels, anti-government people that fight back and they do terrorist acts and that kind of stuff. And one of our main characters comes from this group, Kay, and she's got a quote-unquote brother. They kind of make it sound like he's not really her brother, maybe more brother in arms. And his name is, I believe it's pronounced Ryu. They say Roy in the dubbed, or at least the original. I remember there was an original dubbed version of the movie. When I first went and saw the movie back in the 90s, they played it at a small theater in town, and I went to see it. And I really enjoyed it. It was nothing like the book. The book, like I said, 38 issues, 6 volumes, over 2,000 pages of comic. It's epic. They couldn't fit all that into one movie. And so they basically kind of focused on one part of the story. But I watched it again a few years back, and the dub was completely different. It was much better. Back in the 90s, all the voices were kind of the same voices you would hear on most any anime, and they did the really poor versions and would do a lot of, anytime a character on the screen opened their mouth, whether they were actually supposed to be emitting some kind of sound, the voice actor would throw a sound in there. So if a character is looking at somebody in surprise with their mouth wide open, even though they might be screaming in silence, the voice actor is going, "Hi-ya, or something just really annoying. And they took a lot of that out, and they made it much easier to watch, less painful. And I don't remember if they still called that dude Roy in the newer version. I'll have to go back and watch it. But the whole premise of the first volume is that while they're out causing havoc, Kaneda and Tetsuo and all the other fellas, they're out causing havoc. They run into this dude, and he looks like a little kid, but if a kid of about 8 years old had suddenly aged to about 80, but he stayed the same size, basically he looks like an old little kid. His face is wrinkly and worn. His hair is white, and he's out there, and Tetsuo almost runs into him, and his motorcycle explodes, and he ends up having to go to the hospital. And when the other members of the gang, Kaneda and the other members of the gang, catch up with Tetsuo and they're trying to help him, they see this weird-looking old kid there, and they start kind of giving him some grief. You hurt my friend. We're going to kick your butt. We want revenge for this. You don't do that to one of my people. And this little dude starts freaking out, and like the wall behind him just explodes or something. And the military arrives. I'm trying not to get this confused with the movie. I just read Volume One, just within the last couple of weeks, and it's been years since I've seen the movie. But I can't, it's very hard for me to separate because most of the movie is about kind of this first volume. But at one point, Tetsuo goes to the hospital, and we learn that this little kid is one of three, and they're all three of them are old-looking little kids, and they have some kind of psychic ability, and they are being held by the government. They're some part of some government program, and this group of, I guess, terrorists or activists or whatever you want to call them, they freed this one, and whose name I can't remember off the top of my head, thinking that he was someone that they only know of as Akira. We don't meet Akira at all in the first book. He is a character, but he doesn't show up in the book at all. These other three, again, they're part of this program that I guess they were trying to develop people with abilities, and maybe this is the after effects. They can go no further, and something happened in the past, and now all they can do is just kind of house the last three of them and try to keep them out of trouble. But then these activists come along and free this kid thinking that he's Akira. And there's this great scene with Kaneda and this girl Kay, who is part of the activist group. And then the soldiers, and they're trying to get this kid back. And the kid's got this, he needs to take this pill. And this pill is part of it. And Kaneda ends up getting the pill. And, we find out that Tetsuo has these powers, whether he had them all along or his encounter with this kid caused them to come out. Whether or not, we don't know if his powers would have erupted at any point regardless, or if being in proximity with this kid, having this association, having this close call, almost running into this kid and the kid blowing up his motorcycle, if that awakened his powers. But he ends up being kind of the bad guy of the book. He has this real issue. He's like a childhood friend of Kaneda, but at some point he starts to, I guess, resent the fact that Kaneda is the leader of their group, and he's jealous, and he starts getting these powers, and along with these powers, he gets this massive headache, and he ends up hooking up with a rival biker gang, the Clowns. And he gets a lot of drugs from them, which kind of calms his headache, but doesn't really take it away. And Kaneda and Kay are at one point arrested, and they escape from being held by the government on the site of the future Olympic Games, which is actually a secret government testing facility. And we learn that because each one of these three kids has a number branded into their palm. And we learn that there's another one, an old lady who is somewhere else in Neo-Tokyo. She's got a number branded into her palm, and she's kind of helping the resistance. And it all culminates with Kaneda and Kay escape from custody. He finds out that Tetsuo is back, and that he's gone bad, and that he's exhibiting these powers, and he's running the clown gang, and he needs to be put down because he's a danger. And Kaneda's really upset about this. And so they get all the other bike gangs in the area, and they all team up, and they have this big war, basically this giant rumble with the clown gang. And they have this whole plan put together to try to take out Tetsuo. Because again, you can't just take him out. He's super powerful now. And there's this big fight at the end. And it's not until we learn that Kaneda still has this pill that the little psychic boy that started this whole thing was supposed to take. And it's a super powerful freaking narcotic or something. It's so powerful that it's actually a capsule, and 1 grain from the capsule, if a normal person took it, it might just destroy their brain. But it's exactly what Tetsuo needs to finally just take away his headache completely and give him full control of his powers. And so he's just destroying all kinds of things, and Kaneda's trying to take him out. And at one point, their buddy Yamagata gets Kaneda's pistol, and he tries to take out Tetsuo, and Tetsuo just makes Yamagata's head explode. It is a very violent book. It's a mature book. There's the government figure that we have to deal with a lot. Like the main government bad guy is called the Colonel, and he's a big bald dude. And he's trying to get Tetsuo to come back with him to their facilities. And it's not until after Tetsuo takes this pill that the guy's like, look, you're never gonna get another pill like that again unless you come with us. Where do you think that came from? What do you think withdrawal is going to be like when you can't get another pill? If you need more, if you want to be able to take more of those pills to help with your head and not go through this withdrawal, you got to come with us. And so he does, and that's kind of where the book ends at that point. Now, I'm not a manga guy. I'm just not. It's funny, I grew up watching stuff like Voltron and Robotech, but I've never really been able to get into anime. I grew up reading Akira, but I've never really been able to get into manga. But Akira is like the perfect example of a master craftsman at work. This is almost a perfect book. It's gorgeous. It's definitely manga. It's definitely that style of artwork, but it's not too manga, if that makes any sense. It's almost like manga, but a bit understated. It's almost like manga with a classic feel, a classic American comic book feel. It's hard to explain. You'd have to see it, because it's definitely manga. You can definitely see that there. There's no bones about it, but it's almost somewhat understated. It's almost toned down a bit. It's not trying to be in your face. It's not trying to be flashy. It's there to tell a story, and it's just beautifully crafted artwork that sequentially just flows very naturally. Like I said, master craftsman at work. Again, it's black and white, unless you can get a hold of the old Marvel colorized versions. And there's so much going on in that first volume. I'm not sure how many issues. Here in America, we kind of look at comic books as issues. Is this a 6-issue trade? It's thick. It's almost like a 12-issue, maybe even more trade. Because I just picked up volumes 2, 3, and 4 from the library, and one of them is a bit thinner than the others, so it doesn't really conform to that 6 to 12 issue standard that we have in America. It's just they figured out where within the entire story where the different beats could stop so that they could collect the trades or the publications. Because again, it was originally serialized in a magazine. I don't know. We're talking, I think it said, what did I write down? 82 to 1990. So 8 years being serialized in a magazine. I don't know if this was a monthly magazine. I don't know if this was a weekly magazine. I don't know how many pages per issue that they had, but I am super excited to be reading it again. See, I don't think I've read the full version of this story in 20 years. I've tried to get back into it a number of times. I used to own all 6 volumes. When I was in the 90s and the mid-90s, when I was working at a comic book store, Dark Horse put out hardcovers of all 6 volumes. And they were still the black and white. And I was able to track down all 6 of the hardcovers. So I owned the whole series on hardback, and I read it all back then. And then we went through a really bad financial crisis in the household, and I ended up having to sell a bunch of stuff, and that's something that I sold. Now, since then, they've had all 6 volumes at my local library, and I would go in and I would find, volume 1 is available, but volume 2 is not. So I'd check out volume 1, I would take it home and I'd read it, and then I'd return it. Volume 2 still wouldn't be available. And then maybe a month later, volume 2 is available, and I'd start reading it, but volume 3 is not available. And then 6 months would go by before I was able to get volume 3. But at that point, I couldn't quite remember exactly what happened in volume 1 and 2. And so I'd have to go back and reread them. And because of that, I kept reading volumes 1, 2, and 3 over and over and over again. So you'd think I would have it cemented in my head, but of course, my brain is kind of like a sieve and everything kind of runs through it. And I feel that this is the kind of series that you can't just read one volume and put it down and wait a month or two and then read the second one. You've almost just got to kind of spend the month just reading through all 6 volumes. Just binge it like a freaking show on Netflix. Because I know that I remember from reading it the first time, there becomes a point within the series that a huge change happens. It goes from one set of circumstances to another, just a huge change. And at that point, you might be able to say, okay, this book ended with this happening, and when you pick up the next book, the status quo is completely changed. I feel like maybe at that point, you could probably walk away between those 2 volumes and take a break from the series. But leading up to that, you've just got to read the whole thing through. And then after that, again, I don't quite remember because it's been forever, but I am so excited to be reading this again. And for a long time, I had been trying to get back into it, and I couldn't get Volume 1 from the library. I kept requesting it to be put on hold, and then I would get the email saying, okay, your book is in, come get it, and I would go get it, and it was Volume 4. Well, that's not Volume 1, so I'd put it back on the shelf, and then I would go back on and request Volume 1 again, and then I'd get an email, hey, your book is ready to pick up. I'd go in, and it'd be Volume 2. It's like, what's going on? After like the 4th time that happened, I went to the front desk and I said, hey, what's up here? I keep asking for Volume 1 and you guys keep giving me Volume 2 or Volume 4. You keep giving me anything but Volume 1. And the guy says, well, that's kind of weird. And clinkety-clink, plackety-plack, he plugs it into the computer and he goes, oh, well, it seems that Volume 1 has never been returned. It's been away for over 6 months, so, or however long, a year, whatever. So we have it flagged as stolen, basically. Unavailable. And he says, so here's what you want to do. Get online. You're allowed to request that we purchase books. You can do 3 requests a year, something like that. Just go online and request that we purchase this book and we'll get it purchased for you. And my first thought was, shouldn't that just be something that you do? I mean, if you have the first book in a 6-book series and you have all 6 books, and the first book is stolen or destroyed, shouldn't you just automatically reorder that rather than just ignore the fact that now you have 5 books on the shelf that nobody is going to read because the first book no longer exists, you no longer own it? And so I just, okay, thanks, I'll do that, but I never did. And in the end, I ended up buying Volume 1 myself, thinking that slowly over the next 6 or 7 months, I would slowly purchase each volume because they're really not that expensive. Nowadays you go to buy a frickin' trade paperback that only contains 6 issues in it and you're looking to pay $20 to $25. Well, again, these suckers are about 12 to 15 issues worth of material in one book and they're about $20. That's not bad for a book that size. And so I was just going to purchase the books. And after I finished reading Volume 1, it just happened to be the week. Once a month, the kids and I go to the library. We just happened to be there. Went back to the graphic novels, and they had 2, 3, and 4 on the shelf. So I grabbed them. I started to read number 2, but I didn't want to yet because I didn't want that to be in my mind when I started talking about Volume 1. But now I'm pumped because I can get back to Volume 1. But Akira was a big influence on me creatively, I feel like, because it really kind of guided how I, the kind of stories I look for. Because again, there's a big event that happens partway through the series where the status quo just completely gets turned on its head. But I don't want to spoil it just in case you haven't read it and want to read it, and then read it along with me and follow along as I talk to it here. But Akira, really, it's one of those I would put up there with books like The Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen. And if anybody came to me, when anybody comes to me and says, hey, I'm looking for a new book to read, I'm looking for an epic storyline comic book that's not about superheroes, Akira would be my go-to. It is science fiction, but it's not superheroes. It's very fast-paced. The art is just mind-blowing, amazing. It can be so detailed. and yet so subtle at times as well. It's just an amazing book. And I guess the next step for me is to move on to volume number 2. Join me, won't you? But hey, until then, this episode's over. I'm going to wrap it up because my name is Steven, and I'm just another fanboy. Be nice to each other! Just Another Fanboy is a presentation of the Steven or Else podcast. Questions and comments can be directed to feedback@stevenorelse.com. You can support the show for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/StevenRor and get instant access to the My Other podcast, a weekly show about whatever crawls its way into my tiny little mind just moments before I tap record. You can find me on the World Wide Web at stevenorelse.com or find me on Twitter and Instagram by searching for @StevenOrElse. I also encourage you to subscribe to the show, leave us a 5-star review, and share this episode with a friend. Just Another Fanboy is a proud member of the Comics Podcast Network. You can find that over at comicspodcasts.com. All links will be in the show notes.
Bye-bye, Daddy. Bye-bye, Daddy.
Good job.